In the summer of 1941, the war in Eastern Europe was less than a month old, but the strategic balance had already tilted sharply. On 22nd June, German forces and their allies opened Operation Barbarossa with about 3.8 million personnel along the front, divided into three army groups. Army Group North, with roughly 29 divisions and about 655,000 men, 1,389 tanks, and over 7,600 artillery pieces, drove through the Baltic region toward Leningrad. Opposing it in the Baltic operation were Soviet forces of the Northwestern Front, with about 786,000 personnel, 1,393 tanks, and over 5,500 guns. The northern objective was more than a point on a map. Leningrad was a major industrial center, a primary base of the Baltic Fleet, and a city with a population exceeding 3 million. It also held political and symbolic significance as the cradle of the 1917 revolution. For the German leadership, neutralizing or capturing Leningrad meant securing the northern flank, linking with Finnish forces, and eliminating a key Soviet naval base on the Baltic Sea. For the Soviet leadership, preserving the city meant protecting industry, sea access, and a core element of state legitimacy. This confrontation did not arise in isolation. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 had temporarily aligned Berlin and Moscow, allowing the Soviet Union to occupy eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. The Winter War against Finland exposed weaknesses in Soviet command, logistics, and training, even as it extended Soviet front lines northwest of Leningrad. When Germany decided to break the pact, planners in Berlin viewed the Soviet Union as vulnerable in leadership and doctrine. Soviet planners, in turn, expected a conflict at some point, but misjudged timing, direction, and scale, which shaped the initial imbalance when Barbarossa began. The Northwestern Front, created from the Baltic Special Military District, initially fielded the 8th, 11th, and 27th Armies, with 4 tank divisions in 2 mechanized corps and substantial artillery and air assets. On paper, it matched or slightly exceeded Army Group North in tanks and aircraft. In practice, dispersion along an extended frontier, incomplete mobilization, shortages of trained crews, and communications weaknesses reduced this potential. By early July, many rifle divisions that had begun the campaign near full strength had fallen to half or even 1/3 of their authorized personnel, and mechanized corps had lost large numbers of vehicles through combat, breakdowns, and fuel shortages. On the German side, Army Group North combined conventional infantry armies with 4th Panzer Group under General Erich Höppner. Within that Panzer Group, LVI motorized corps under General Erich von Manstein formed one of the principal spearheads. Its 8th Panzer Division, supported by motorized infantry divisions such as 3rd Motorized and later SS Totenkopf, was intended to exploit breakthroughs rapidly, crossing the Dwina, seizing Pskov, and pushing toward the old imperial capital along the Luga axis. German operational doctrine assumed that speed and concentrated armor would compensate for exposed flanks and the limited road network of forests and marshes in the Baltic region. For the first 3 weeks, events seemed to confirm those expectations. During the Baltic operation from 22nd June to 9th July, Army Group North advanced through Lithuania and Latvia, forcing Soviet withdrawals from Kaunas, Daugavpils, and Riga. Northwestern Front counterattacks, including the commitment of over 60,000 men and more than 1,300 tanks at Raseiniai, inflicted losses but did not halt the German drive. By July 9th, Pskov had fallen and Soviet forces were retreating toward the area between Lake Peipus and Lake Ilmen, trying to establish new defensive lines while under air attack and facing shortages of ammunition, fuel, and transport. Inside the Soviet command structure, the setbacks produced rapid changes. Colonel General Fyodor Kuznetsov, who had led the Northwestern Front at the outbreak of the war, was replaced in early July by Lieutenant General Pyotr Sobennikov. At the same time, Stavka, still headed militarily by Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, with Joseph Stalin increasingly asserting direct control, inserted representatives such as General Nikolai Vatutin to supervise and coordinate front-level decisions. In this atmosphere, local commanders like Lieutenant General Vasily Morozov of the 11th Army were expected not only to slow the enemy, but also to demonstrate that coordinated offensive action was still possible. For German field commanders, the situation looked different. Their reports emphasized rapid daily advances and large numbers of Soviet prisoners, but also noted the difficulty of moving armored and motorized formations along few usable roads and bridges, often over soft ground. By mid-July, spearheads of LVI motorized corps were many tens of kilometers ahead of their supporting infantry, leaving flanks and rear areas covered only by thin security detachments. This pattern created opportunities for Soviet counterstrokes, even as the overall strategic trend remained in Germany's favor. Among Soviet political leaders and the population of Leningrad, the need for a first clear success grew more urgent as reports of retreats accumulated. Official statements stressed that the invader would be met with strong counterblows. Local party and military organizers prepared militia formations and new defensive lines, but also watched the approaches from Pskov and Novgorod with concern. In this context, a limited but well-timed combined arms counterattack by the 11th Army against the 8th Panzer Division near the small town of Soltsy would soon be presented as proof that the Red Army could still disrupt a panzer advance. Later, it would be remembered by some as Stalin's first victory, even though its psychological impact would far exceed its long-term strategic effect. By early July 1941, the rapid advance of Army Group North had carried German spearheads from the Lithuanian frontier to the approaches of Lake Ilmen. After the capture of Pskov on July 9th, LVI motorized corps received orders to press on without pause toward the line of the Luga River, the last major natural barrier before Leningrad. The 8th Panzer Division, at the core of this corps, moved in column along limited road axes through Ostrov and Porkov toward the railway junctions of Dino and Soltsy, covering tens of kilometers per day over forested, marshy ground intersected by rivers such as the Shelon and Polist. The terrain around Soltsy shaped what followed. The town lay on the Shelon River along a key road and a rail line running northeast toward Novgorod and Leningrad. Away from these routes, dense woods, bogs, and secondary tracks made large-scale maneuver difficult and restricted armoured units to narrow corridors. For German planners, this channeled advance routes and simplified orientation. For Soviet planners, it offered a chance to strike at extended columns whose flanks and rear areas were held mainly by small security detachments and field garrisons. Within the LVI motorized corps, Erich von Manstein directed the offensive with the expectation that Soviet resistance had been largely broken by preceding encirclements and air attacks. The 8th Panzer Division, which had begun the campaign with over 200 tanks of various types, supported by motorized infantry, artillery, and engineers, was tasked with gaining bridgeheads over the Shelon and driving on towards Staraya Russa and the Luga Line. Luftwaffe aircraft from Luftflotte. One provided reconnaissance and ground attack support, further reinforcing confidence in the ability to maintain momentum despite stretched supply lines. On the Soviet side, the situation was characterized by retreat and reorganization. The Northwestern Front, now under Lieutenant General Pyotr Sobennikov, pulled back battered formations towards successive defensive lines, covering Novgorod and Leningrad. The 11th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Vasily Morozov, withdrew through Ostrov and Porkov, leaving behind destroyed bridges and burning depots. Divisions that had started the campaign with 10,000 to 12,000 men now often fielded 4,000 to 7,000 effectives, with many artillery pieces and vehicles lost or abandoned during earlier engagements. At Stavka level in Moscow, reports from the north described a pattern similar to other sectors: rapid German penetration and Soviet units falling back under pressure. Yet the command also received indications that the leading German motorized formations were outrunning their infantry and supplies. Around 11 to 12 July, orders reached the Northwestern Front to organize a counterstroke against the exposed spearhead of LVI Motorized Corps. The task was to cut the main road south of Soltsy, disrupt the advance of 8th Panzer Division, and demonstrate that coordinated counteroffensive action was still possible. The plan that emerged at front and army level involved a combined arms grouping built around elements of the 11th Army. Rifle formations such as the 71st and 237th Rifle Divisions were to attack from the north and south of the Soltsy axis. They were supported by the 21st and 24th Tank Divisions and motorized units, together fielding over 200 tanks on paper, mainly T-26 and BT series with a smaller number of heavier vehicles. Artillery regiments were assigned to provide concentrated fire on key road junctions and river crossings, while the remnants of the front air forces were instructed to strike German columns and bridging points where possible. Preparations were compressed into a few days. Many Soviet battalions marched at night to assembly areas in forested terrain west and southwest of Soltsy, moving along secondary tracks to avoid German aerial observation. Communications between rifle, tank, artillery and air components relied on field telephones, runners, and limited radio sets, making coordination difficult. Nevertheless, staff officers drew up schedules for attack waves, artillery barrages, and river crossing operations intended to encircle or at least severely damage the forward elements of 8th Panzer Division. For German troops and commanders advancing towards Soltsy, these Soviet movements were largely invisible. Reconnaissance units reported scattered Soviet detachments, demolished bridges, and isolated artillery positions, but not a major concentration preparing a counterattack. Civilians encountered along the route included local residents, kolkhoz workers, and refugees moving eastward with carts and livestock, carrying mixed accounts of burning towns and retreating Soviet troops. To many in the German columns, the pattern resembled earlier stages of the campaign. By 13th July, advance elements of 8th Panzer Division had crossed the Stalin on improvised and captured bridges near Soltsy, establishing bridgeheads and forward positions on the eastern bank. The bulk of the division, its supply columns, and attached units stretched along the roads back toward Porkov and Dino. The infantry divisions tasked with securing flanks and lines of communication were still marching far to the rear. In the forests and marshes north and south of the main axis, rifle regiments, tank battalions, and artillery batteries of the 11th Army took up positions. On July 14th, this configuration of extended German spearhead and assembling Soviet counterattack forces would transition from movement to engagement. At the level of German high command, the operational logic behind the drive towards Soltsy followed a clear sequence. Army Group North was tasked with reaching the Leningrad area within the first campaign phase, roughly in the space of several weeks, before Soviet mobilization could generate fresh armies in depth. Within this framework, LVI Motorized Corps was ordered to exploit the capture of Pskov by pushing along the road network via Ostrov, Porkhov, and Soltsy, then towards Staraya Russa and the Luga line. The 8th Panzer Division was to seize and hold crossings over the Shalon River, open routes for follow-on infantry, and prevent the formation of a stable Soviet front south of Lake Ilmen. The planning assumptions of LVI Motorized Corps reflected the doctrine that had brought earlier victories in Poland and France. Armoured and motorized formations were expected to penetrate rapidly, bypass strong points, and sow disorganization by reaching command and supply centres in the rear. Infantry divisions would follow at a measured pace to clear pockets and secure flanks. Logistically, supply columns moved along a limited set of roads and rail lines running back through Riga and Pskov, with fuel and ammunition prioritized for the leading units. Air reconnaissance from Luftwaffe formations was expected to detect any significant Soviet regrouping. the likelihood of a coordinated counterstroke against the spearhead was assessed as low. On the Soviet side, goals and planning were shaped by a different reality. With the front receding toward Leningrad, Stavka instructed the Northwestern Front to delay the enemy, preserve combat-capable units, and gain time to build the Luga defensive line and mobilize local reserves. For the 11th Army, this translated into a dual task: withdraw in an organized manner to cover Novgorod and the southern approaches to Leningrad and, where possible, launch counterblows against advancing German formations to break their tempo of operations. Around 11 to 12 July, directives from Stavka and the Northwestern Front headquarters converged on the idea of a concentrated counterattack near Soltsy. The operational intention was not to reverse the overall campaign, but to inflict significant losses on the forward elements of LVI motorized corps, disrupt the crossing of the Stalin, and force Army Group North to pause and divert forces from its main axis. The chosen method was a combined arms strike, rifle divisions advancing from north and south of the main road, tank formations attacking into the German flank and rear, and artillery concentrating fire on road junctions, bridges, and assembly areas. Translating this intention into a workable plan under conditions of retreat and disruption required compromises. Several Soviet tank divisions and independent tank regiments in the sector had already lost a high proportion of their vehicles. Staff officers had to recalculate groupings based on actual numbers of serviceable tanks, trucks, and tractors, concentrating them into temporary task forces. Ammunition expenditure in earlier defensive engagements limited the planned duration and density of artillery fire. Fuel stocks constrained how far tank units could maneuver off the main roads and how long they could remain in action without resupply. Communications formed another critical element of planning. German armoured and motorised units relied heavily on radio at all levels, from division to company, for coordination and rapid reaction. In contrast, many Soviet rifle regiments and artillery units still depended on field telephones and messengers, with limited radio sets concentrated at higher headquarters and in tank formations. The counterstroke plan therefore emphasized relatively simple axes of advance, prearranged time schedules, and clear geographical objectives such as road crossings and villages near Soltsy, in order to reduce the dependence on real-time coordination during the engagement. Both sides misjudged aspects of the situation. German commanders correctly perceived that the Soviet front was under severe strain, but underestimated the ability of surviving formations to regroup under front-level direction and exploit the vulnerabilities created by extended spearheads. The pattern of earlier days, in which local Soviet counterattacks had been uncoordinated and quickly overcome, reinforced a belief that the main danger lay ahead rather than on the flanks and rear. Soviet planners, for their part, overestimated the prospects of encircling and destroying a major armoured division in a single operation, given German mobility and air support, and the degraded state of their own formations. Propaganda and information policies added another layer to these plans. Soviet communiques issued in early July emphasized counterattacks and cooperation between infantry, tanks, and aircraft, reflecting both political requirements and a desire to sustain morale in Leningrad and other rear areas. Reports of the forthcoming counterstroke near Soltsy were framed in this context, as evidence that organized resistance continued and that German advances could be checked. German internal reports and public announcements focused on the continued forward movement of Army Group North and the capture of towns and prisoners, with little attention paid to the risks created by long supply corridors through forest and marsh. Thus, by the evening of July 13th, the planning cycle on both sides had reached its initial conclusion. For LVI Motorized Corps and the 8th Panzer Division, the next days were expected to bring further rapid advances toward the Luga line. For the Northwestern Front and 11th Army, they were designed as the moment to test whether a hastily assembled, combined arms counterattack could exploit the exposed posture of a leading German panzer formation. The Soltsy Counterstroke would soon demonstrate how these plans interacted once contact was made. On July 14, 1941, the configuration shaped over the previous days turned into direct contact. Before dawn, Soviet artillery units of 11th Army opened fire on road junctions, suspected German command posts, and bridge approaches near Soltsy. The barrages were not continuous due to limited ammunition, but they were concentrated in short bursts around the main road south of the town and the crossings over the Stalin. For Soviet gun crews, many of whom had been retreating for weeks, this marked the first time they fired as part of a coordinated offensive plan rather than as rearguard support. Shortly after the artillery preparation, rifle regiments began moving from cover in the forests north and south of the road. Elements of the 71st Rifle Division advanced from the northeast toward the high ground overlooking Soltsy and the Stalin crossings. From the south and southwest, units of the 237th Rifle Division moved toward villages and road sections used by columns of 8th Panzer Division. Their task was to block the main route and pin German units in place so that Soviet tank formations could strike at the flanks and rear. Around the same time, battalions from the 21st and 24th Tank Divisions entered the battle. Many of their T-26 and BT tanks moved along forest tracks or fields parallel to the main road, guided by local inhabitants or reconnaissance detachments. Some machines broke down or became stuck in marshy ground, but enough reached their start positions to form compact groups. When they emerged onto the road network near German supply columns, the effect was immediate. German drivers and support troops, who had expected low-level harassment at most, suddenly faced direct tank fire at close range. For the forward combat elements of 8th Panzer Division, the first indications of the counterstroke were reports of Soviet tanks and infantry appearing on secondary roads behind and beside their marching routes. Radio messages from reconnaissance units and regimental headquarters referred to Soviet concentrations that did not match previous estimates. Command posts quickly ordered local countermeasures, including hastily formed blocking groups with anti-tank guns and field artillery dragged into direct fire positions along the road embankments. In the area around Soltsy itself, German units holding the bridgeheads on the eastern bank of the Stalin came under renewed pressure. Soviet rifle companies probed forward through low ground and tree lines, attempting to isolate isolated strongpoints near the bridges. Mortar fire and small arms engagements increased in frequency. For soldiers on both sides, the front line was fragmented, with small groups fighting for farms, copses, and road cuts rather than a continuous trench system. The civilian population experienced these first engagements as a sudden shift from transient passage of troops to sustained combat. In Soltsy and nearby villages, residents who had remained to protect property or livestock encountered artillery impacts, burning vehicles, and shifting lines of control. Some assisted Soviet units with information about paths and crossing points. Others sought shelter or tried to move eastward along crowded tracks, passing both retreating and advancing military units. As the day progressed, German attempts to restore order along the main axis met growing difficulties. Supply and maintenance columns, largely composed of non-combat personnel, were not structured to repel armoured and infantry attacks. Some were overrun, with trucks and fuel dumps destroyed or captured. Elsewhere, German officers organised improvised defensive positions using available anti-tank guns, machine guns, and a small number of tanks turned back from the forward elements. The previously linear march formation began to break into a series of localised strongpoints. For Soviet units, initial successes created both opportunities and new challenges. Tank crews reported destroyed or abandoned German vehicles and prisoners taken in roadside engagements. Rifle regiments in some sectors reached designated blocking positions on the roads south and west of Soltsy. At the same time, losses mounted from German air attacks and from well-sighted anti-tank positions covering open approaches. Communications between advancing Soviet groups remained irregular, and some units moved faster than neighbouring formations, creating gaps that German detachments could still use. By evening on July 14th, the first phase of the clash near Soltsy had produced a complex front. Portions of the 8th Panzer Division found themselves under attack from multiple directions, with elements effectively cut off along stretches of road and in villages south and southwest of the town. The division was not destroyed, but its previously continuous advance toward the Luga line had been interrupted. For German soldiers in the affected sectors, the day marked a transition from fast movement to localized defensive fighting. For Soviet participants, it represented evidence that a coordinated counterstroke, combining artillery, tanks, and infantry in difficult terrain, could impose operational strain on a leading German panzer formation, even while the broader front remained under pressure. On July 15th, the fighting around Soltsy expanded in space and intensity. During the night, Soviet staff officers adjusted their plan based on reports from forward units. Rifle regiments that had reached the roads south and west of the town received orders to hold blocking positions, while tank battalions were redirected to strike at German groups that still retained freedom of movement. Additional artillery batteries shifted their guns forward to new firing points in clearings and along riverbanks, despite the risk of air attack at first light. For 8th Panzer Division, the day began with attempts to re-establish continuous control along the main route. Regimental commanders organised Kampfgruppen from available tanks, motorised infantry, engineers and anti-tank guns to reopen road sections cut by Soviet forces. They aimed to restore access between the forward elements east of the Stalin and the rear services still moving up from Porkhof. Radio traffic within the division increased, with reports of Soviet armour appearing simultaneously in several sectors, forcing choices about where to commit limited reserves. The Luftwaffe played a larger role as weather and airfield conditions allowed. Ground attack aircraft flew repeated sorties against Soviet columns and suspected artillery positions, following reports from German ground observers. Soviet tank units advancing in open areas or crossing exposed stretches of road suffered losses from bombs and strafing runs. At the same time, low-flying aircraft attempted to disrupt Soviet command posts and bridges over smaller streams that supported the counterstroke. These air actions reduced Soviet freedom of movement but did not fully break the pressure on the roads around Soltsy. Within Soviet formations, the counterattack placed new stress on command and logistics. Tank brigades and divisions reported consumption of fuel and ammunition that exceeded the capacity of improvised supply lines running through forest tracks and damaged roads. Some units halted after initial successes because they lacked fuel to continue deeper into German rear areas. Rifle regiments holding blocking positions faced shortages of mortar rounds and medical supplies as casualties increased. Battalion-level commanders had to decide whether to maintain forward positions under growing pressure or withdraw slightly to more defensible terrain. Terrain and weather added further complications. Local rain showers turned sections of dirt roads and fields into soft ground, complicating the movement of both tanks and wheeled vehicles. Forest and marsh areas that had provided concealment now also restricted lateral movement, making it difficult for Soviet units to support each other once engaged. German attempts to bypass Soviet blocking positions often ran into new obstacles or ambushes, creating a patchwork of small battles in villages, on road junctions, and near improvised bridge sites. Casualties rose on both sides. German reports noted destroyed or abandoned tanks, damaged artillery pieces, and losses among supply troops caught in roadside engagements. Soviet records, where preserved, describe tank companies reduced to a fraction of their starting strength and rifle battalions that lost a significant proportion of their personnel in attacks on well-sighted German positions. Medical stations near the rear collected wounded from mixed units, often without clear identification of division or regiment in the first hours after evacuation. At higher headquarters, the unfolding crisis required rapid assessments. In the command post of LVI Motorized Corps, staff officers analysed fragmented reports and recognised that the spearhead around Soltsy was under greater pressure than expected. Requests for reinforcement led to the redirection of elements from nearby formations, including parts of motorised infantry divisions, to help stabilise the corridor and support a coordinated effort to break through Soviet blocking lines. This diversion of forces slowed the broader advance toward the Luga line. In the Northwestern Front and 11th Army headquarters, the same events were interpreted as confirmation that the counterstroke had achieved significant disruption. Commands sought to bring additional rifle units and artillery into the sector to close remaining gaps and, if possible, complete an encirclement of major parts of 8th Panzer Division. However, the need to hold other sectors of the front and the limited transport available meant that reinforcements arrived gradually and sometimes without full ammunition loads. Political and informational considerations resurfaced as reports reached Leningrad and Moscow. Preliminary accounts highlighted German vehicles destroyed, prisoners taken, and the forced halt of the advance near Soltsy. Internal briefings presented the counterstroke as an example of effective cooperation between infantry, tanks, and artillery under difficult conditions. At the same time, commanders were conscious that the operation was being conducted by forces already weakened by previous retreats, and that any prolonged engagement risked further attrition of units needed for later defensive lines. By the night of 15th to 16th July, the battle had entered a critical phase. Parts of 8th Panzer Division were still encircled or constrained along short stretches of road, while other elements had managed to regroup into compact defensive clusters. Soviet forces maintained pressure along several axes but faced increasing fatigue, logistical strain, and gaps in coordination between neighbouring units. The next phase would determine whether the counterstroke produced a temporary disruption or a more lasting operational setback for the German advance toward Leningrad. On the 16th of July, the engagement around Soltsy reached its highest intensity. Before dawn, Soviet units that had spent the night reorganizing moved again. Rifle regiments holding the blocking positions on the roads west and southwest of the town received orders to tighten the ring, advancing several kilometers toward identified German strongpoints. Tank battalions, reduced in strength but still operational, prepared to attack from multiple directions against road segments where German columns remained compressed between forest and marsh. For 8th Panzer Division, the day was defined by attempts to break the growing encirclement. Divisional headquarters assembled several Kampfgruppen built around remaining medium tanks, motorized infantry companies, and engineer detachments. These groups were tasked with punching corridors through Soviet positions to restore a continuous line to Porkhov and to relieve units isolated near Soltsy and along the Stalin. Anti-tank and field artillery batteries were redeployed to cover likely Soviet approach routes, forming layered defensive belts around key junctions and bridge sites. The resulting clashes took place at close range. In villages and along narrow clearings, Soviet tank crews used short advances, followed by rapid fire from covered positions, aiming at German vehicles grouped on the roads. German gunners, often operating from hastily prepared positions along ditches or embankments, responded with armour-piercing fire at known crossing points and gaps in tree lines. Infantry on both sides fought for individual houses, barns, and small patches of high ground that controlled line of sight to the roads. Artillery and air power amplified the density of the fighting. Soviet batteries concentrated on road segments where intelligence indicated the presence of German command and logistics elements, firing salvos that disrupted column movement even when they did not destroy vehicles outright. German artillery, coordinated through radio, shifted fire rapidly to support local breakout attempts. Aircraft from both sides appeared over the battlefield, though in different roles. German ground attack planes targeted Soviet tanks and gun positions, while the reduced Soviet air component sought to strike road concentrations and pontoon sites on the Shalon. Within the Soviet 11th Army, staff officers attempted to direct these engagements to complete the encirclement of major parts of the division. New orders instructed some tank companies to bypass strongpoints and cut deeper behind German positions, while rifle units were told to seal gaps between their sectors. However, limitations in communications meant that many decisions were taken at regimental or battalion level on the basis of local information, producing uneven progress. In some sectors, Soviet units advanced several kilometers. In others, they remained engaged in positional fighting for isolated farms or hillocks. For the civilian population, the peak of the battle meant continuous danger. Villages near the main roads changed hands more than once as German breakout attempts and Soviet counterattacks crossed the same ground. Residents who had remained found themselves in the midst of moving tanks, artillery flashes, and shifting small arms fire. Some used cellars and improvised shelters. Others tried to move on foot or by cart toward the east, but encountered roadblocks or active fighting and were forced to turn back or seek alternate paths through the forest. Casualties reflected the intensity of these engagements. Company and battalion returns on the Soviet side recorded tank companies reduced to a handful of vehicles and rifle units reporting losses that significantly altered their combat strength. German internal reports noted destroyed and disabled tanks, losses among motorized infantry, and the destruction of fuel and ammunition columns. Medical services on both sides worked under strain, with evacuation routes threatened by artillery and air attack and field dressing stations established in barns, schoolhouses, or forest clearings. At the level of Army Group North and the Northwestern Front, the situation around Soltsy now demanded priority attention. For the German command, the disruption of 8th Panzer Division threatened the timetable for reaching the Luga line and required the commitment of additional forces to restore freedom of maneuver. For Soviet higher headquarters, the visible halt of the German spearhead offered a rare opportunity to claim a clear operational success and to justify further efforts to reinforce the sector, even at the cost of weakening other parts of the front. By the evening of the 16th of July, the battlefield around Soltsy presented a complex picture. German breakout efforts had reopened some corridors, but portions of the division remained under pressure and movement toward Leningrad was still interrupted. Soviet forces retained positions astride key roads, yet they had not achieved a complete, stabilized encirclement. The campaign in this area had reached its highest point of mutual effort, with both sides seeking to translate local gains into a decisive operational result. By July 17th, the battle around Soltsy shifted from rapid maneuvers to a pattern of resistance, improvisation, and adaptation on both sides. Soviet units of the 11th Army, having expended much of their offensive energy in the previous 2 days, now faced the task of holding blocking positions against repeated German breakout attempts. German troops of the 8th Panzer Division and attached formations, no longer advancing toward the Luga line, focused on restoring cohesion, securing supply routes, and extracting isolated groups from exposed positions. In Soviet command posts, reports from rifle and tank regiments led to a reassessment of aims. The prospect of maintaining a tight encirclement of the entire Panzer Division diminished as German Kampfgruppen reopened some corridors. Orders shifted from deep thrusts into the German rear to a combination of localized counterattacks, defensive ambushes along roads, and systematic disruption of movement. Sapper teams laid new minefields on likely bypass routes, felled trees across narrow tracks, and prepared demolition charges for bridges and culverts that German engineers were attempting to repair. Tank units adapted to their reduced strength by changing their role. Instead of massed attacks, companies of a few remaining T-26 or BT machines were held back as mobile reserves behind rifle sectors, committed against specific German breakout attempts or concentrations identified by reconnaissance. Crews used hold-down positions on the edges of clearings or small rises, firing on vehicles confined to road embankments. Where tanks could not move effectively, anti-tank rifle and gun teams took over, using prepared fire sectors and pre-measured distances along road bends and bridge approaches. German formations responded with their own adjustments. Commanders in 8th Panzer Division reorganized scattered elements into compact, all-around defensive groups anchored on villages, crossroads, and bridgeheads. Supply and maintenance personnel were formed into improvised infantry platoons to reinforce perimeters or hold short stretches of road. Engineer units took on a central role, clearing mines, building corduroy surfaces over soft ground, and restoring at least one viable corridor for movement in each sector deemed essential for the planned breakout and regrouping. Communications practices evolved as well. German radio networks, which had already formed a core component of operational flexibility, were now used not only to transmit orders, but to build a more accurate picture of Soviet dispositions along the encirclement arc. Reports from forward observers and reconnaissance patrols identified gaps between Soviet units and areas where artillery and air support could be concentrated to open passages. On the Soviet side, staff officers intensified the use of liaison groups moving on foot or horseback between neighboring regiments to coordinate fire plans and prevent German exploitation of unguarded intervals. Civilians in the Soltsy region also adapted to the changing conditions. Some villagers, having experienced the passage of both armies, began to conceal food stocks, draft age men, or draft animals to reduce the likelihood of requisition from either side. Others were drawn into road and bridge repair work under German or Soviet supervision when control shifted. Information flowed in multiple directions. Local residents guided Soviet reconnaissance through forest paths or warned German patrols of minefields, depending on prior contacts, immediate security pressures, and individual assessments of risk. The psychological dimension of this adaptation was significant. For many Soviet soldiers who had retreated from the border regions through Lithuania, Latvia, and northern Belarus, the sight of a German panzer division compelled to fight for local positions and to request reinforcement rather than continuing a continuous forward drive provided tangible evidence that the invader could be slowed and damaged. Officers used the experience of Soltsy in briefings, pointing to destroyed vehicles, captured equipment, and halted columns as proof that coordinated countermeasures could offset disadvantages in training and recent experience. Among German troops, the same events produced a different set of impressions. Drivers, mechanics, and signals personnel who had expected limited contact in the rear now found themselves under artillery and small arms fire. Panzer crews, accustomed to operating with freedom of movement on wide roads or open terrain, experienced constrained maneuver in forests and marshes combined with close-range engagements against tanks and guns appearing from concealed positions. These encounters reinforced the idea that even in sectors where the overall campaign seemed favorable, local Soviet resistance could create situations of uncertainty and loss. Higher headquarters in both camps incorporated these lessons. For the Northwestern Front, the Soltsy experience underlined the value of using forested and marshy terrain to channel German movement and of committing tanks and artillery in concentrated short-duration blows rather than in dispersed, piecemeal fashion along a broad front. For Army Group North, the disruption of 8th Panzer Division highlighted the risks of pushing armoured spearheads far ahead of supporting infantry without fully securing flanks and rear routes, particularly in regions with limited infrastructure and multiple natural obstacles. By the evening of July 17th, the pattern of the battle reflected this phase of resistance and adaptation. German units had reopened some lines of communication and strengthened several strongpoints but their posture around Soltsy remained defensive rather than offensive. Soviet formations still held key road sections and maintained minefields and ambush positions, yet their ability to sustain further large-scale attacks was diminishing as fuel, ammunition, and manpower were consumed. Each side had adjusted its methods to the realities of the local terrain and the accumulated strain of weeks of campaigning, setting the stage for the decisions that would determine how and when the fighting in this sector would end. On July 18th, the character of the fighting around Soltsy shifted decisively. During the night, both commands reviewed the situation. In 11th Army headquarters, reports showed Soviet rifle units still positioned across several key road segments and tank detachments in depth behind them, but with fuel, ammunition, and personnel depleted after 4 days of combat. In the command posts of LVI Motorized Corps, staff officers recognized that elements of 8th Panzer Division were no longer merely impeded, but at risk of being worn down in place if a coordinated effort to reopen communications failed. The German command therefore concentrated on a single main breakout axis. Rather than attempt to maintain every forward position around Soltsy and on the eastern bank of the Shalon, divisional orders prioritized restoring a continuous route westward toward Porkov. Kampfgruppen built around the remaining medium tanks, reinforced by motorized infantry and engineers, were assigned narrow, clearly defined sectors where artillery and air support could be concentrated. Units in less critical positions received instructions to conduct delaying actions and then fall back toward designated rally points once the main corridor was secured. On the Soviet side, 11th Army sought to maintain pressure while stabilizing exhausted units. Some rifle regiments were ordered to dig in more deeply along road cuts and village outskirts, while tank companies were held in reserve to counter any major German attempt to break through. Artillery batteries, short of shells, prepared limited fire plans against likely assembly areas and road bottlenecks rather than broad barrages. The intention remained to prevent the full restoration of German maneuver capability and, if possible, to retain leverage over segments of the division still operating near Soltsy and the Shalon crossings. Shortly after dawn, German artillery and mortars opened a sequence of concentrated fires along the chosen breakout route, targeting Soviet strongpoints identified over previous days. Ground attack aircraft followed, striking tree lines and suspected gun positions along the road. Under this cover, Kampfgruppen advanced in compact formations, with tanks at the front and flanks, infantry close behind, and engineers clearing mines and obstacles. The attack focused on specific Soviet blocking positions that controlled bends, small bridges, and junctions. For Soviet units manning these positions, the pressure was qualitatively different from earlier engagements. Instead of dispersed probes, they faced sustained assaults supported by coordinated artillery and airstrikes. Some platoons held for several hours, inflicting losses on advancing German vehicles at pre-measured distances before withdrawing to secondary positions. Others were forced out of trenches or houses by combined small arms and indirect fire, leaving gaps that German engineers and infantry quickly exploited to widen the corridor. As the day progressed, reports from forward Soviet units indicated that the ring around parts of 8th Panzer Division was loosening. German columns that had been separated now established physical contact along sections of the road west of Soltsy. In several places, Soviet attempts to restore blocking lines through counterattacks by remaining tanks or hastily assembled infantry groups met concentrated anti-tank and machine gun fire and were pushed back with additional losses. At the same time, Soviet reconnaissance confirmed that fresh German infantry elements were moving closer from the rear, threatening to shift the balance further if the engagement continued unchanged. Faced with this development, the Northwestern Front and 11th Army commands reassessed their objectives. The counterstroke had already halted the German advance for several days, inflicted losses on armoured and motorised units, and forced Army Group North to divert forces into the Soltsy sector. but the possibility of encircling and destroying a large portion of 8th Panzer Division now appeared remote. New directives therefore began to emphasize withdrawal to prepared or partially prepared positions closer to Novgorod and the Luga line, preserving surviving tanks, artillery, and rifle cadres for future battles. The implementation of these orders varied along the front. In some sectors, Soviet units disengaged in the late afternoon and evening according to plan, pulling back through forest tracks and across smaller rivers, while leaving minefields and demolitions to delay pursuit. In others, formations under immediate German pressure could not break contact cleanly, and sections of rifle battalions or individual tank crews were overrun or cut off during the transition. German reports from the same hours note captured prisoners, destroyed Soviet vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel, and recovery of their own disabled equipment from contested road segments. By nightfall on the 18th of July, the immediate outcome of the turning point was clear. German forces had succeeded in opening and securing a main corridor west of Soltsy and re-establishing continuous control over their supply line to Porkov. Elements of 8th Panzer Division that had been constrained along isolated stretches of road or in villages were able to regroup and join larger formations. At the same time, the division emerged from the engagement with reduced strength, considerable material losses, and a need for reorganization before resuming large-scale offensive action. For Soviet participants, the conclusion of the Soltsy fighting combined withdrawal with a sense of having achieved a limited but concrete effect. The advance of a leading German panzer formation toward Leningrad had been interrupted for several days. Vehicles, equipment, and prisoners had been taken, and the counterstroke had demonstrated that coordinated action by infantry, tanks, artillery, and local air support could disrupt even experienced mechanized units. For German troops and commanders, the same events underscored that rapid exploitation through forested and marshy terrain carried significant risks if flanks and rear areas were not adequately secured. The fighting around Soltsy thus reached its turning point, not through a single decisive clash, but through a series of linked decisions and actions on July 18th that shifted both sides from offensive ambitions to a focus on restoration and withdrawal. The tactical initiative on the immediate battlefield passed back to the German side, while the broader operational tempo of Army Group North had been altered by the need to absorb the effects of the counterstroke and reorganize its spearhead before continuing the drive toward Leningrad. In the days following August 18th, the tempo of operations in the Soltsy sector declined sharply. The immediate priority for 8th Panzer Division and LVI Motorized Corps was to convert the reopened corridor into a stable line of communication and to extract remaining units from exposed positions. Recovery teams moved along the roads west of Soltsy, towing disabled vehicles, salvaging equipment, and evacuating wounded personnel to field hospitals farther to the rear. Divisional staff compiled preliminary loss reports, noting tanks written off, damaged but repairable machines, missing personnel, and the status of artillery and motorized infantry battalions. German formations that had been drawn into the battle were now reorganized. Elements of 8th Panzer Division, which had entered Barbarossa with more than 200 tanks and a full complement of motorized infantry, emerged from Soltsy with a significantly reduced number of operational vehicles and depleted infantry companies. Workshops in the rear worked to restore damaged tanks and trucks, but this process required time, spare parts, and transport capacity that also had to serve other units of Army Group North. Infantry divisions tasked with securing the corridor took over some frontline duties, allowing the panzer formation to pull back slightly from the most exposed positions. For the Soviet 11th Army, the end of the engagement meant a controlled withdrawal toward new defensive lines. Rifle divisions that had held blocking positions along the Soltsy roads received orders to fall back in stages toward the approaches to Novgorod and the developing Luga line system. Rearguard detachments remained in selected villages and at bridge sites to delay German follow-up with limited artillery and demolition charges. Tank units, reduced in strength, were moved behind the prospective new front to serve as a mobile reserve rather than remain in direct contact with German spearheads. During this withdrawal, organizational continuity became a central concern. Staffs compiled new orders of battle, merging understrength battalions and regiments and reassigning surviving officers and specialists. Replacement drafts arriving from interior districts were directed to units that had fought at Soltsy, where they joined experienced cadres who could pass on practical lessons from the counterstroke. Artillery and engineer units that had supported the operation were redistributed along the wider front, bringing with them tested methods of minefield placement, road demolition, and concentrated fire on road bottlenecks. The civilian landscape reflected the passage of the battle and the transition to occupation in parts of the sector. Villages near the Stalin and along the main roads showed traces of burned vehicles, damaged houses, and improvised graves. Some residents had left with withdrawing Soviet forces, particularly those connected to state institutions or local administration. Others remained under emerging German control, facing requisition of food, livestock, and buildings for billets, as well as new regulations affecting movement and work. For those living between the shifting lines, the priority was to restore basic subsistence and avoid becoming entangled in military operations. Humanitarian consequences became more visible as the front moved away. Medical units on both sides reported continued inflows of wounded from the Soltsy fighting for days after the main clashes ended, including cases evacuated late from forest clearings or isolated strongpoints. Local civilians assisted in transporting wounded by cart or boat where mechanized transport could not reach. The dead from both armies and from the civilian population were buried in individual and mass graves near villages, roads, and former positions, some marked with simple signs, others left with only temporary indicators. At the operational level, German headquarters assessed the Soltsy episode in terms of lost time and reduced combat power. The need to halt and reorganize 8th Panzer Division delayed the drive toward the Luga line and required adjustments in the schedule for the approach to Leningrad. Commanders examined the causes of the disruption: extended spearheads, insufficient infantry and security elements on the flanks, and the challenges of operating in forested, marshy terrain with few roads. Some measures were introduced to strengthen flank protection and to coordinate more closely with supporting infantry in further advances north and northeast. For the northwestern front and the broader Soviet command, the aftermath of Soltsy combined the recognition of a localized success with the reality of continued retreat. Reports to Leningrad and Moscow emphasized that a leading German panzer formation had been halted and compelled to fight its way out of a difficult situation. At the same time, planning documents and orders acknowledged that the main defensive effort would now shift to the Luga line and to the urban and fortified zones closer to Leningrad. The remnants of the units that had executed the counterstroke were integrated into these new defensive schemes. Locally, the end of the Soltsy engagement marked a change in how both sides used the area. For German forces, the sector became part of a supply and transit zone supporting continued operations toward Novgorod and Leningrad, with garrisons established in towns and at key junctions. For Soviet planners, the same region was now behind the immediate front line, but remained a potential zone for partisan activity, intelligence gathering, and future operations if the strategic situation allowed. By late July, active combat in the immediate vicinity of Soltsy had declined to patrols, occasional artillery exchanges, and small contacts along the new line of contact. The main weight of the campaign shifted northward and eastward, toward the Luga defences and the approaches to Leningrad itself. The counterstroke of 14 to 18 July had concluded as a discrete phase, a period during which a retreating Soviet army had imposed a temporary halt and losses on an advancing German panzer division, followed by a renewed German movement and continued Soviet withdrawal toward the city that remained the central objective in the northern sector. In the broader chronology of 1941, the Soltsy Counterstroke occupies a narrow interval between the collapse of the border defences and the formation of deeper defensive lines around Leningrad. Militarily, it did not reverse the strategic situation. Within weeks, Army Group North reached the Luga line, bypassed and forced back successive Soviet positions, and by early September closed the land approaches to Leningrad. Yet the episode near Soltsy left a layered legacy that differed for frontline participants, higher commands, and later historians. For the formations directly engaged, the effects were concrete. Divisional records and later estimates indicate that 8th Panzer Division lost on the order of several dozen tanks temporarily or permanently out of action, along with hundreds of killed, wounded, and missing personnel. Soviet rifle and tank units of the 11th Army suffered higher overall casualties in personnel and a substantial reduction of their remaining tank park, but they achieved the immediate operational aim. The German advance toward Leningrad along the Soltsy axis was halted for several days and forced into a reactive posture. Within the Red Army and Soviet political leadership, this outcome gained importance beyond its territorial scale. In the first weeks of the war, many early counterattacks had been repulsed with heavy losses and little effect. At Soltsy, commanders could point to a coordinated action in which infantry, tanks, artillery, engineers, and air units operating in difficult terrain had imposed disruption on a leading panzer formation, compelled it to break out of an adverse position, and delayed its timetable. Internal reports and later training materials presented the operation as an example of combined arms cooperation under conditions of retreat. This success also had a psychological dimension. For troops retreating toward Leningrad, the knowledge that a German mechanized spearhead had been forced to halt and fight defensively countered the impression of uninterrupted enemy momentum. In party meetings and press materials, Soltsy appeared as one of the first named engagements where German units had been checked in open battle in the initial period of the campaign. The phrase that this was the first victory of the new phase of the war, later associated with the leadership, reflected this search for concrete evidence that the invasion could be resisted. At the same time, the interpretation of Soltsy within the Soviet command contained elements of overestimation. The counterstroke suggested that energetic, localized attacks against exposed spearheads might suffice to stabilize the front in multiple sectors. In practice, the material and organizational conditions that enabled the Soltsy operation could not be replicated everywhere. Later counterattacks in 1941, launched with similar expectations against German armoured formations near Smolensk, Kiev, and elsewhere, often produced high casualties without comparable operational effect. The belief that isolated tactical successes could offset large-scale imbalances in training, logistics, and air superiority contributed to costly decisions in subsequent months. For German operational thinking, Soltsy provided a different kind of lesson. The episode demonstrated that the extension of armoured spearheads far ahead of supporting infantry could create exploitable vulnerabilities, especially in regions with limited road networks and substantial forest and marsh. After July 1941, Army Group North devoted more attention to securing flanks and improving coordination between panzer groups and following infantry armies. However, the overall confidence in the Barbarossa timetable and in the ability to regain the initiative after local setbacks remained largely intact until the cumulative effects of losses and extended supply lines became evident later in the year. In later historical writing, the prominence of Soltsy varied. Immediate wartime and early post-war Soviet accounts mentioned the operation as an early example of successful counterattack, but it shared attention with larger events such as the defense of Leningrad, the battles near Moscow, and later turning points. In German memoir literature, Soltsy appeared primarily as an episode illustrating the dangers of forest and marsh terrain and the resilience of Soviet forces, rather than as a central event in the Northern Campaign. International studies of Barbarossa often summarize the Baltic and Leningrad sectors in broad strokes, mentioning Soltsy only briefly or not at all. For civilians, the legacy of the counterstroke combined with that of the subsequent occupation and siege. Residents of Soltsy and surrounding villages remembered the sequence of advancing and retreating forces, fighting in and around their homes, and the transition to German control. Local memory associated the July battles with burned buildings, destroyed bridges, and the first graves along the roads. These experiences were later integrated into regional narratives of the war, connected to the larger story of the Leningrad front, but anchored in specific places and families. In analytical terms, the Soltsy Counterstroke stands as an illustration of how a tactically and operationally successful action can be both significant and limited. It showed that the Red Army, even during a general retreat, could assemble a combined arms grouping, exploit terrain, and inflict measurable losses on an advancing mechanized formation. It also showed that such a success, carried out over several days and a restricted sector, could not in itself alter the course of a campaign driven by larger structural factors, force ratios along the entire front, logistics, command systems, and strategic planning on both sides. As a result, the operation near Soltsy occupies a dual position in the history of 1941. For those directly involved, it marked a concrete moment when the direction of movement temporarily changed, and an advancing formation had to fight to avoid encirclement. For the overall trajectory of Operation Barbarossa and the siege of Leningrad, it remained one episode among many in a larger sequence of advances, counterattacks, and reorganizations. Its legacy lies in this combination of local impact, early demonstration of effective combined arms action by Soviet forces, and limited influence on the strategic outcome, which together explain why it was remembered intensely in some circles while remaining less prominent in the wider historical record.